introduce you properly. Although Robert wrote his first short story at 12, he only properly came to writing in his 30s, when he actually gathered the courage to return to school and ended up with a Master of Fine Arts in fiction. This book, The Prophets, has met with significant acclaim and has achieved its goal of paying tribute to the virtuosity of Black writers, including Toni Morrison, James Baldwin and Alice Walker. Since 2008, Robert has been writing a blog called Son of Baldwin, which has open discussion about race, sexuality, gender and disability, and many of those themes you will know are front and centre in The Prophets. The Prophets' main characters, Samuel and Isaiah, are two enslaved young men who work, live and love together on a plantation they call empty. The joy of their love and the impacts of how others respond to it is the essence of the story. Robert Jones Jr., congratulations on this work, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Meri, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Beaufort Street Books, and I am so happy to be here. Thank you.
Especially at 7 o'clock in the morning, your time?
It is 7 o'clock in the morning, so greetings from your morning that you passed already.
Yeah, we've done that, yeah. Now, I mentioned the blog, and on Twitter you are at Son of Baldwin, and I'd love to ask you about your first reading of James Baldwin's work, the Here Be Dragons, and about how it impacted you and got you thinking in what could have been the very early germination of The Prophets.
Yes, I returned to college at the age of 31 after watching an Oprah Winfrey show about finding your purpose. And the gentleman she had as a guest said, you know what your purpose is and you've been avoiding it most of your life. And you've been avoiding it because you're afraid of, or it seems insurmountable, the task of going about now in this stage of your life, finding it. But don't think about the last step you have to take. Think about the next step you must take. And when I thought about the next step and researched the next step, it was that I would have to return to school. And so I returned to college at 31 years of age. And one of the first courses I took was called People, Power, and Politics, which was a political science course. And in that course, I was assigned to read an essay by this man called James Baldwin, who I've heard of, but I didn't really know much about. And Here Be Dragons was the essay, and it was one of his final essays. And I read it, and I thought it was just sheer brilliance. And from reading that essay, I said, okay, I am going to look for every single thing that this man, James Baldwin, has written, and discovered that he was Black, that he was queer, that he grew up in New York City, and that he was a prolific writer. All of the things that either I was or wanted to be. And that was what started me on my journey. It was almost like a sign that I was on the right path, that as this gentleman on Oprah Winfrey show said, if I took the next step, I would eventually be led to my destination. And so that is the first thing that made me think I could actually be a writer. I could claim this as my purpose and not as some sort of side project or hobby, which I had here to then thought of it as something that was, you know, a pipe dream, perhaps that I could not actually obtain, but here it was in my grasp. And thanks largely to James Baldwin, I obtained it.
Mm. And there was an essence in Here Be Dragons that was about Black homosexuality and gender fluidity that spoke really powerfully to you as well.
It was the first time I probably encountered the idea of masculinity being a construction, that gender itself was not something that was biologically determined, but was really just a construction based on the sort of agenda of the society I lived in. That was simply profound to me, because when you're a child, you're taught this is a boy and this is a girl, and there's nothing in between, and you fit into one of these boxes. And so to encounter the idea that maybe there's more than just that, or there are things that are different than that, was really mind blowing and freeing.
Before I can only imagine. I mean, and I think that's actually something that you've delivered in the Prophets more broadly for anyone who reads it. But before we start to talk about the Prophets specifically, I just want to stay with James Baldwin for a little bit longer, because I was really interested to hear you say in a conversation that in actual fact you didn't read Black writers for quite some time into your life, and so I'm really interested in your intent to really, I guess, give space to some of these really powerful Black writers who perhaps haven't been heard as much as they should have been, but also about like what the revelation was for you when you did start reading Black writers, because James Baldwin wasn't the first.
No, the first Black writer that I ever encountered on my own, in terms of I was conscious that this was a Black writer that I was reading, and that their works really opened up the idea that I could be writing about my own life, because I had previously only read white writers because that was the education I was receiving in um, elementary school and middle school and high school. But I encountered Terry McMillan's first book, Mama, when I was about 16 years of age, and was startled because I didn't realize that, one, a Black writer could write, and two, that that Black writer could write about something that was specifically Black cultural objects, Black cultural life. So at 16, I started writing a novel that I never finished, inspired by Terry McMillan because of her sort of the revelation that these could be topics I could write about. But after that, had not really encountered Black writers as often. I found a writer by the name of James Earl Hardy, who wrote something called B-Boy Blues, which was the first book I read about Black queerness, and then some other writers before I actually got to James Baldwin, and um, others like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and so on and so forth. Um, but it was a confirmation for me to be able to encounter these writers, learn from them, because there are no writers that I have learned from more than James Baldwin and Toni Morrison. And I have a picture here that's off camera of Octavia Butler, and particularly Black women writers have had the most profound impact on me as a writer, particularly as a fiction writer. Zora Neale Hurston, all of these other writers that I discovered during my college career. So I would say that um, these ancestors, some of them are ancestors. Alice Walker, thank goodness she's still here with us, so she's an elder. Um, I could not have made this journey. I could not have written this book. And if anyone who's read it, you see the acknowledgement section, which is its own chapter in itself. Um, Without those names, without those people who I call upon, who I studied, um, the prophets could not have been made. I
Mm.
would not have been a writer if not for them.
Yeah, it's a culmination of absolutely everything that happened before you.
Yes, indeed. I am fully aware that I am writing in a tradition with the help of the ancestors.
Mm. I briefly introduced Samuel and Isaiah in my introduction, but would you introduce them further for those who haven't read the book yet?
Sure. So Samuel and Isaiah are two young men who are enslaved on a plantation in the South of United States, in a state called Mississippi, which Mississippi has been known as one of the most brutal places for slavery. It was called the Deep South, and all enslaved Africans feared moving to Mississippi because of of its particular brutality. But also other states in the Deep South, such as Georgia and Louisiana and Alabama. Um, and so these two young men are enslaved on a plantation. They meet as children, and they feel a spark that they don't quite understand until they get a little bit older and realize that they are in love. So it was love at first sight, but they had no context for what love is, because all they had seen was brutality and separation and horror. And so they fall in love. And Samuel is the more aggressive of the two, while Isaiah is the more measured. And but what links them is a really intimate and passionate love for one another. And the story itself, the prophets, revolves around that love, how they see one another, how the other enslaved people on the plantation see them and their love, as well as the enslavers, how they think about Samuel and Isaiah and how they see their love. And then there's also a through line back to the pre-colonial African societies, in which Samuel and Isaiah's love is given a history, so that it's clear that Samuel and Isaiah are not an anomaly, that they have sort of a precursor in two other young men who were also in love and destined to be together, by the name of Kosai and Alewa. So that's a little bit about Samuel and Isaiah and their love.
Thank you. Let's talk about that pre-colonial history in Africa, because I know that I read that you studied Africana when you were studying, so there was obviously a depth of understanding for you there already. But there must have been some pretty profound research. What was available to you? Like, who had recorded the history?
There was, when I first started looking for examples of Blackness and queerness that occurred prior to America's, United States Harlem Renaissance, which was in the 1920s, which was the earliest I could find examples of. There was an author by the name of Wallace Thurman who wrote a book called The Blacker the Berry, where he was discussing not very much, but the idea of Black queerness in 1929. That was the earliest I could find. And my question was, well, where were they before then? So it took me quite a bit of time to find first a seminal work called Boy Wives and Female Husbands, written by some anthropologists, sociologists, about what they learned about um, particular African societies' ideas about gender and sexuality prior to European colonization. And there were lots of examples of um, third genders, or the idea that everyone is a girl until the child themselves chooses a gender, or the idea that king was just a word, and anyone who was deemed the leader of the tribe was king, whether male or female or other. All of these ideas I'm encountering, but I still wanted something um, from the indigenous Africans themselves to tell me what the history of their tribes were like. And I found it in um, a woman by the name of Esther Arma, who is Ghanaian. She's from Ghana. And she talks about, she says to an American audience, if you had asked my great grandparents, what is a homosexual? They would have said, I don't know, we don't have that. And you would have walked away from that as a Westerner thinking, oh, there were no homosexuals in Ghana. But had you explained to them what you meant by the word homosexual, they would have said, oh, you mean love. Because for them, there was no need for her, that tribe, and I believe the tribe was called Ga. There was no need for um, them to single out homosexuality or transgender or what have you. They saw it as all part of nature, all part of the landscape. That was all love and all sex. She said, um, love was like the land. There were no boundaries. And so it was that that freed me to be able to talk about these pre-colonial African societies in a way in which I felt comfortable, drawing on very various tribes' um, uh, their thoughts about um, sexuality and gender, and sort of using this fictional tribe, the Kasango people, to sort of use the pieces of it that I thought would be best to contrast against um, what comes later when Africans are enslaved and brought to the so-called New World.
When you write about the love of Samuel and Isaiah, it's like the purest, most beautiful, uh, joyous, unproblematic kind of love. And I wondered what it was like to write their relationship.
It was freeing because um, I did not want to shy away from the sexual part of their relationship, because often when we have these sorts of characters in mainstream media, um, in order to protect the sensibilities of an audience that might have some homophobia or anti-queer sentiments, we skip over the sex as quickly as possible and only talk about the love in ways that are distant but suggestive. I wanted to ensure right off the bat that we address that they are sexual beings and they have sex with one another, but also that that's only one aspect of their relationship. The other is that they are intensely in love with each other in very passionate, joyous, intimate ways that show up not just as um, touch, but speech and playfulness and proximity. Um, and it was just so lovely to write about that, um, because it's not only something that I experienced as a Black queer person myself, but that I know so many other Black people, Black queer people want to see in terms of an example of Black queer intimacy.
Mm. I wanted to, this is all in no particular order really, but the biblical reference is really strong in the book, and the fact that the characters not only are given biblical names, but also that they adopt characteristics of the biblical character whose name they bear. What was your thinking behind doing that?
Well, a couple of things. I really wanted to criticize Christianity, particularly its use in colonial projects to subjugate those who are being invaded. So, one of the ways in which that subjugation occurred was Europeans would um, kidnap these Africans, force them into slavery, tell them that they no longer had the names that they were given by their own people, and they were given Christian names, almost as a way to brainwash them into thinking that they were lesser, inferior, that slavery was their deserved plight. So I wanted to sort of show the ways in which Christianity functioned in that way, how it stripped Africans of our identity, my ancestors of their identity, and remade them into this slave, which is a non-person almost. But I also wanted to use those names in a way in which they emulated in some ways, and in some ways argued against the biblical figures in the Bible. So for example, there's a character by the name of Maggie. That character is based loosely upon Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene was a very rebellious and sort of transformative figure in the Bible, in that she did not meet particular standards of the society she lived in, and yet Jesus still sort of rocked with her. And sort of she was the one who did not betray Jesus, as opposed to the others who were, talking, bad about her, but then wound up being the ones that betrayed Christ. Um, and then there's, for example, Paul, who is in the prophets, he is the plantation owner and one of the most cruel in the novel. And I named him after Paul in the Bible because Paul is also rather cruel and misogynistic and homophobic in his passages in the Bible. So there's some overlap in the ways that the naming and the chapters work with the Bible, and then there are also some chapters from the Apocrypha, the books of the Bible that were left out for particular reasons. And King James, for example, wanted to take out all of the references in the Bible where Christ wasn't seen as divine, where he was only where he was seen as human. King James had a project to remove those books, or if he was seen as flawed, he wanted those books removed. So the Bible that we're reading now, the King James Version, is incomplete. And so I wanted to sort of suggest to that with sections like the Maccabees, for example, or Bel and the Dragon, where there is a history that's unspoken. And so that was sort of the point of naming those chapters in those ways, to sort of suggest these two are histories that are unspoken.
Mm. Yeah, I am imagining just the intensity of the thought that has gone into every tiny aspect of this book, in the sense of, was that something that you then came up with later on and decided to go back and change everybody's name and change the names of the chapters and change everything because you wanted to include that? Or was it part of the original plan that just emerged as you wrote the book?
I should let everyone know that it took me 14 years to write The Prophets. I started thinking about it in my final semester of undergraduate in college in 2006. And I first started writing it in my first semester of grad school in about September, October of 2006. And wrote it over and over and over again until my editor, Sally Kim at Putnam, and I decided it was finished, which was in early 2020. And that whole process was about 14 years. And no, I did not always know that it was going to look like the way it looks now, this finished project. It actually started out just from one character's point of view. It was going to be told from Isaiah's point of view. And initially, Isaiah's name was Hannibal, and the book was going to be called Sing Hannibal, Bear Witness. And I was going to write it in the form of a slave narrative, but realized really quickly that Hannibal's or Isaiah's point of view was so limited. And so I said, well, maybe I can write it from the point of view of Hannibal and his lover, Simon, who eventually becomes Samuel. And still, that was not enough. And at that time, I was going to call it Plantation Lullabies. Um, but
Oh,
that
that's
didn't
the
work.
Michelle and De cello album.
That's right. That was inspired by Michelle and Cello's album. And it seemed to fit. And still, that wasn't enough. And then I realized um, I have to reckon with what was pulling them apart, which was these Christian and biblical ideas. And then their names started to change. I changed Isaiah and to Samuel. And the book was then going to be called the Book of Samuel because he was going to take a prominent role. Still, that didn't work. And I realized that it was their love that was at the center of this, and that love needed witnesses. And that's when the other characters started to speak to me. And in their speaking, I started to hear ancestral voices. One came to me in a dream that said, "You do not yet know us," and realized that they were speaking as prophets in the Bible spoke in these really commanding ways. And I realized, all of the characters have to have biblical names for one reason or another. Um, these ancestral voices are speaking as though they're speaking prophecies. Maybe this book should be called, for those reasons, The Prophets. And that was maybe, I would say, 6 to 7 years into the process when I realized that was the route that I was supposed to be going. And since that worked, since I wasn't running into the same roadblocks and same conundrums that I was running into when prior to this, I realized that this was the right structure and this was the right title for the book.
It just goes to show what a vocation this book has been for you, that you were able to press on despite all of the barriers that you came up against in how you would tell the story. I want to ask you about the women, because you talked at the very beginning, you talked about how important Black women writers were to you, but the female characters in this book are incredibly powerful. I'd love you to talk more about them.
One of the things I set out to do um, almost immediately when I was writing this book was to ensure the solid representation of Black women. Because so often in Black communal spaces, Black men take precedence. Black men are made primary, and there is a sort of patriarchal control of Black community spaces. And I wanted to ensure that Black women had just as prominent a role in these ideas about historical resistance to slavery, leadership, because you know, if you're in the United States and maybe even outside the United States, names like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey come to you, almost rolls off your tongue, but not so much Ella Baker or Harriet Tubman or these other women, Black women leaders. And so I wanted to ensure for my ancestors, but also for the women in my family, the elder women in my family that I knew, like my great aunt Annie, who was my grandmother's aunt, who I used to go to her house in the South, in South Carolina for the summers, not knowing that the house that I was living in, she and her husband built with their own hands on land that her own grandmother was enslaved upon, and she was given her grandmother was given a parcel of land after she was freed by the slave master. And that land was passed down to my great aunt Annie, and she built her own home on it. And I'm playing on this land my my childhood summers, not knowing what this land was. So I'm paying homage to my elders, like my great aunt Annie, who passed away, and her sisters, and my grandmother and her sisters, these strong and vulnerable and funny and loving and skeptical and smart women of my family go into the creation of these characters like Maggie and Essie and Pua and B Auntie and Sarah in particular, who form this community of Black women in this book, who all have their own separate, different personalities, but come together when it's necessary. So that was very, very, very important to me.
I want to go back to, you mentioned that the first time that you were spoken to by the ancestors, that you heard you do not yet know us, which is actually on the cover of my book, because I've got a proof copy that has that on the front. And I would love you to tell us a little bit more about that experience, because it's something that is actually is experienced by characters in the book as well, a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, and you know, until you just said that, I did not realize that was happening. I, I I'm sure somewhere in me I was aware that these characters were having that same experience, but you just articulated it in a way that made it like clear to me, like, oh yes, they're doing that. I'm doing that in the book too, and I didn't realize it. So I keep on my nightstand by my bed a pen and a pad, because you never know as a writer when the inspiration is going to strike and when a line or an idea is going to come to you. And you think at first, and I used to do this, oh, I'll remember it in the morning. And then in the morning, I forget it. And I'm like, ah, I should have wrote it down. Um, so I got into the habit of keeping a notepad and a pen by the bed. So it's about maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning when I wake up out of this dream where somebody is talking to me, an older person, and get up and it's dark. And so I just grabbed the pen and pad and I scribbled it down and put it down, and then went back to sleep and forgot all about it. I woke up the next morning to come into my office to start to work on the manuscript, and I bring the pad with me and set it down in front of me. And I looked at it and it said, in scribbled handwriting, "You do not yet know us." And I thought, what? And I'm like, this voice seems so outside of what I'm already writing in the manuscript. The voice sounds more regal. It's a direct address. Um, how do I fit this in? And that was when I said, oh, the ancestors want a voice in this book. They want to be able to speak directly to me, directly to these other characters in the book, directly to the reader. Um, how do I do that? So I started to write a chapter. You do not yet know us, you do not yet understand. Um, and it started to flow quite easily, this chapter. And I was thinking, okay, so the question of structure is, how do I fit it in a way that isn't jarring? So I started reading works by Toni Morrison, like her book Paradise. And I read The 12 Tribes of Hattie by Ayanna Mathis to see how she sort of accomplished this multi perspective structure, polyphonic. And it started to feel natural, weaving in this narrative. But until you said it, I didn't realize that these voices also come into the chapters with the characters themselves to sometimes talk to Maggie or show themselves even to Maggie or to talk to Sarah or to inhabit Sarah and speak through her. And so that was quite the experience. And it was in the process of writing this that I began to think about my own spirituality outside of a Christian or I don't know if the audience know, I was raised in a house that was half Nation of Islam and half Christian, or it was the particular denomination was African Methodist Episcopalian. Um, and my mother rejected both of these religions because she would not call herself a feminist, but she rejected patriarchy outright, which then gave me the path to reject the sort of homophobia of both of those structures, so that I could come to my own spiritual beliefs, which I, I realized in the creation of this book was ancestral veneration. So again, as I said in the beginning, I could not have written this book without hearing the ancestors. And the best time to hear them was in the dreaming, but also in the process, what that the practice that I felt best um, was the best time to write this book was, which was the witching hour, the magic hour, 3 o'clock in the morning is when I felt like the world was quiet enough for me to hear those voices and write them down.
There's a beautiful kind of sense that you achieve in hearing those voices, which is the voices come from the darkness, they come from the shadows, but they represent light, like a kind of a revelation and connection to the ancestors. And it's just one of the billions of brilliant things that you do in this book. But it's a play on the idea that darkness and blackness is bad and white is good. And it's so deft. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, that one of the things that I came to understand, partly because of my grandfather's participation in the Nation of Islam, is how Black things are always cast as evil. If something bad happens, we say blacklisted, blackballed, blackmailed. Um, Black is always Black cats are bad luck. We're always associating dark, bad, evil with darkness, including my very own skin tone. When you um, see things on television, you know, the Black person is the villain or the villain is dressed in black, and it's just always um, sort of disturbed me the way that that permeates our cultures and makes us think of anything Black, including people, are inherently evil. So I wanted to sort of show how Blackness could also be spaces of, like you said, revelation and love, because Samuel and Isaiah, their lovemaking is in the dark. Um, and so I wanted to sort of push back against that idea that darkness is evil and scary and bad. or that Blackness itself is evil and scary and bad.
Oh, the evil, scary badness came from the whiteness in the prophets. I wondered about I mean, there's a lot of empathy that goes into writing characters in the way that you have, and to exploring the actual experiences that people have gone through that you're writing a fictitious story about. And I wondered about the personal impact, the trauma for you, the effect that it's had on you to do some of this research and to really understand how, and to write, but to deeply understand how harrowing these lives were and how just appallingly these human beings were treated.
During the research, one of the most, I knew going into this that slavery was bad. I did not realize how bad it was. Some of the testimony, for example, there's a story where there was an uprising in Louisiana of enslaved people. They lost. The uprising was squashed by the enslavers, and as punishment, so that the enslaved would never try to rise up again, they beheaded hundreds of people and mounted their heads on spikes that stretched for miles. It was like something out of Game of Thrones. You would never think that really happened in real life, but it did. The other part is I learned about these breeding farms where they would force enslaved people to procreate, to breed. It was like a rape factory. When I encountered these ideas, I was almost destroyed to understand what my ancestors endured and what they survived. My goodness, what they survived. So there were moments where I had to put the books down or not write and go take a walk in the park or meditate or go play with my nieces and nephews and nibblings. Nibblings is the non-binary term for nephew or niece. And I have a non-binary, one of my brother's children is non-binary. And just, first of all, thank them for surviving so that I might be here. But then to also be scolded by them in a way, to say, we went through this. The least you can do is witness it. We're giving you our testimony. Witness it. So be strong. Take your breaks if you need them, but do not falter in your duty, which is to tell this story.
That's an incredible responsibility that you've picked up and carried all of this way.
I feel the weight of it. I really do.
I wanted to ask you about the sitting with dissonance, and you write it beautifully in the chapter called about Adam, and you write about the internal conflict, the identity, and I'd love to hear you speak about that more and about why that was part of. I mean, not clearly it was part of the story, because as you say, the whole breeding situation and the rape factories and all of the disgusting stuff that was going on created a whole lot of people who lived with that as part of a much greater trauma. But tell us a little bit more about the dissonance.
Adam is one of my favorite characters in the novel because of the complexity, the nuance, the contradictions, where he, for all intents and purposes, looks white. But because of the way the United States defines race, he can't be white because his mother was probably biracial, probably white and black. And in the United States, I'm not sure if people in Australia are aware, we have something called the one drop rule, which means that if you have one drop of black blood, you are black, no matter what you look like. So one drop is defined by 1/32. So like if one great grandparent was black, then you're black, no matter if all the other people are white. So it's this really strange thing, the way race is constructed in this country. And I wanted to sort of explore that. Um, Adam being this, I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't read it, but being a character who has black and white in him. Him trying to determine where his loyalty should lie. Should it be with his poor mother, who was a victim of somebody else, or should it be with his father, who is white? Should he try his best to pass for white, or should he be with who he thinks may be his people, the other enslaved people? That was just such an interesting thing to think about and to write about. What is his place? Will he be accepted by the enslaved people who are much more readily discerned as black? Um, or will they reject him too, as white people might reject him once they discovered that he had black blood? Um, where does he fit in? Um, and what does that do to the person who is multiracial? Where do they find community? All of these things were just so interesting to explore.
I want to give the opportunity for people in the room to ask questions. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? I have other things I want to ask Robert, but but I know you probably do too. And there's also the opportunity for people online to just join in the chat. I'll be able to see if you'd like to write something in the chat that I can ask Robert as well. Does anybody?
I've just, blue never has met, in the past, blue with blue. But after reading your book, I look at blue in a totally different way. From the wildflowers burst in shades of blue, perfect enough to hurt feelings. And I thought, wow. Where did that come from?
Where did that come from? When I was writing the book, thank you for that question, by the way, and thank you for noticing the blue. That comes from, while writing the book, I'm trying to channel and think about language, presenting language in a way that is, if not novel, at least interesting. And so what I did was I listened to music. I listened to the oldest Black music that I could find. So I was listening to blues music from like the 1920s, from artists such as Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, old American blues music. I was listening to gospel music, particularly by Mahalia Jackson. And in all of it, I was finding a sort of melancholy, a sort of sadness in the joy, even if they're singing about overcoming. There is still this heaviness, this sorrow that to me looked like the color blue. And you know, we talked about the music, we called it the blues. And I said, how do I represent that feeling, that music, that rhythm, that melancholy and sadness and sorrow, using the color blue? So every time I try to use the color blue, I wanted it to have sort of a heaviness, or that even in its beauty, the reader could detect the sorrow even in the center of the beauty. And so I looked to Toni Morrison in terms of how she sort of broke open the English language and made it into something um, palpable and something tangible and something utterly beautiful and poetic. I wanted to sort of do something like that. So I was reading a lot of Morrison. I was listening to a lot of music, and blue was the first color that I kind of saw and wanted to explore more, and so wanted to use throughout the book to sort of convey the feeling of blue, being blue. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Does anyone else have another question? I did want to ask you, Robert, because I'm mindful that we've kept you for a long time, but I want to ask you, your introduction letter in the book starts with the dilemma of being compelled to write but never knowing if it's good enough, and not knowing really if the prophets could be told, which you have spoken about with us tonight. But you expected and prepared yourself for hatred about this book.
I did. Meri, to this day, I am still profoundly insecure about this work being in the world, because I worry, is this good enough to convey this story? Was the writing up to the level that it needed to be? Did I have the appropriate skill to tell this story? To this moment, I still have those insecurities. And I also am afraid of how this book would be received, particularly by people who don't want to believe that Blackness and queerness have always been a part of the landscape. There's a set in the United States, and maybe other places as well. There are certain people in certain Black communities who think that if you are Black and queer, or if you talk about Blackness and queerness, you are somehow attacking the Black family or emasculating Black men in a way that makes us vulnerable to attack, to violence, to white supremacy and other sorts of violence. And that I, as a Black queer person, should be trying to not be queer. I worried that they would read this and think, oh, he has an agenda. He is attempting to weaken us as a people. I still have that fear. But I was compelled to tell the story of people who have been overlooked, ignored, and erased, who have always been a part of the landscape and who needed their stories to be told. I truly feel that these ancestors, Samuel in particular, who oftentimes when I was writing, I would hear a voice in my head said, no, that's not true. And I sort of included that in the book. There are sections where it says, no, wait, that was a lie. And that was, sometimes Samuel would say that to me, like, no, that's a lie, when I was trying to make him kinder than he actually was. So I had a duty to tell this story, but also was utterly afraid of telling it because of how I thought it might be received. Thus far, I have not received much sort of negative criticism, but there has been some that I am glad that I'm sort of shielded from, because I can sort of not look at it if I don't want to look at it. But yeah, I still live in a profound sort of insecurity about this work being in the world, and hoping that it is received with the intention that I put into it, but knowing that it might not be, because, you know, all of us are different, and some people bring their own experiences, their own thoughts and ideas to work, to art. And so I just hope that the spirit in which I wrote it is the spirit in which it will be received for most people.
Well, I hope that you don't dwell on any of the negative feedback, because it really is the most extraordinary work, and people in the room just shaking their heads in disbelief when you were telling us that just now. I'm not in a position to tell you how wonderful this is, except as a reader, and it really has changed my thinking on so many things. And thank you so much. It's been an absolute honour to sit here and hear you speak about your work tonight. Congratulations, Robert Jones Jr.
Oh, thank you. I want to say to you, to Beaufort Street Books, to the audience, that was the first applause that I have heard.
Oh,
Let's do it again.
Yeah. I don't want you to go. Stay. Are you going to be okay?
For another hour.
Yeah.
Is someone there to hug you?
Yeah.
Can you hug Baldwin? His cat's called Baldwin.
I was thinking the picture.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh my gosh. Wow.
Amazing.